Dr. Smallwood, Commissioner Trapp, who greeted us when we first got here, for the welcome and the opportunity to be with you. And to each of you for giving me just a little bit of your attention, and then more importantly, I want to have a chance to listen to you and learn from you and hear what's on your mind. I'm asking ultimately for your support to serve in the highest position of public trust and power in the United States of America. In order for me to be able to meet your expectations and know what you expect of the next president of the United States, it's incumbent upon me to listen to and learn from you, understand what your aspirations are, what your concerns are, and then perhaps as important as both of those, what the solutions are to the challenges that this country faces right now. I have to tell you that I just left the Civil Rights Museum. I thought I understood the history of the Civil Rights Movement and of the Greensboro Four, which I now know are the A&T Four. As we were into the museum, I made that mistake, and Tony corrected me. He said, look, on February 1st of 1960, it was not the community of Greensboro that supported what those four courageous men were doing. It was the student body here at A&T from which they came, and then I just learned a little bit about Dr. Gibbs, his history, his leadership. We're in a building named after him, and that's deepened my understanding of not just this school and this community, but really of this country and our history. And I hope it speaks in some way to our future, because in the same way that Blair, McNeil, McCain, and Richmond had the courage and the audacity to sit at that lunch counter and to galvanize the conscience not just of this community, but really to shock the conscience of this country, joined by dozens, then by hundreds. I learned about the students at Dudley High School, even younger than they were, younger than you are right now. That courage, inspiring those who would follow them later. We saw in that same museum, you've seen it yourself, images, videos of the Birmingham Children's Crusade. So 1963, 3 years later, 1,200 children arrested on the first day of the protest. And we saw pictures of the trees off of which the bark had been stripped by the fire hoses that were used against absolute children, including elementary school children, who were marching not just for their own rights and their own future, but the rights of everyone in this country and the future of everyone in this country. And at one point in that tour, you see one of my fellow Texans, Lyndon Baines Johnson, signing into law the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. And very often we are tempted to give him credit and others who held those positions of power or public trust in Congress or in the White House, but really it was those four students on February 1st of 1960. It was those children in Birmingham, Alabama. It was the Freedom Riders who took their lives into their own hands when they got on board those Greyhound buses. And it was everyone who preceded them who stood up for themselves, their rights, and for this country finally achieving its foundational creed, which is that we are all created equal. And the idea is to equal opportunity and equal application of the law, something that we have never fully realized, not on February 1st, 1960, not on this date in the year 2019. One of the docents who guided us through the exhibit, there was a picture of a Klansman leaving his house, his wife and children kissing him goodbye as he's in his robes, and she reminded us the Klan alive and well in the United States of America today. A president who describes members of the Klan and neo-Nazis and white supremacists as very fine people. A president who traffics in racism and racist tropes, warns us of invasions from other countries, Central America or Mexico, calls people who are at their most desperate and vulnerable and defenseless killers, predators, animals, and infestation, dehumanizing people so that we are given permission to treat them as something less than human. There is an open pattern of invitation, not just to racism, but to the violence that necessarily follows. On August 3rd, this month, this year, in El Paso, Texas, a gunman inspired in some part by the president's own rhetoric, who in a manifesto that he published that day warned of the invasion of Hispanics coming to this country, drove 600 miles to a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, my hometown, and opened fire, killed 22 people, injured dozens more, changed our community, in some way changed our country, and forced a decision for all of us. Will we be defined by that kind of white supremacist terror? Will we go back? Or will we frankly acknowledge where we were all along? Or will we overcome this and transcend the racism, the fears, the anxiety, the paranoia that some seek to stoke for political gain or for whatever advantage for themselves at the expense of others? That's the question on the table for us right now. And I'm beginning to understand, but I'm here to listen, but I'm beginning to understand that my experiences in this country as a white man are vastly and starkly different than the experiences of many other in this country. Give you an example. As a young man, twice arrested for stupid offenses. One, incredibly stupid, driving under the influence of alcohol. The other for attempted criminal trespass. Neither of those arrests, neither of the nights I spent in a county jail ever defined or determined my future or my outcomes. Prevented me from getting a job or qualifying for a student loan or being able to start a small business or raise a family or really enjoy the freedoms and the greatness of this country. I think about the fact that there are 2.3 million people behind bars right now, disproportionately comprised of people of color, many there for nonviolent drug offenses, including possession of marijuana, which is legal in most states in the country. Largest prison population on the face of the planet, and everyone behind bars will face consequences different than mine. Checking a box on every employment application form, preventing them from holding that job or qualifying for a student loan to come to this institution, constraining their options and consigning them to a much more narrowed future. We look at the economy in America, 10 times the wealth in white America than there is in black America. Voting in Texas, until 2018, we ranked 50th in voter turnout. Not because we love our democracy less than you do here in North Carolina, but because we were literally drawn that way. Not by accident, but by design. People of color drawn out of congressional districts to diminish the power of their vote or the likelihood that their voice would ever be heard, reaching the logical conclusion that their vote counted for something less than someone else's, solely based on the color of their skin, and they stayed home. Not represented or reflected in this great democracy that we brag to the rest of the world about. A maternal mortality crisis 3 times as deadly for women of color in my state, and yours, and across this country. In other words, the manifestations of what I am talking about are reflected in every single aspect of American life right now. Not only is it unjust, not only have we failed to fulfill our promise to ourselves, to future generations, and to the rest of the world, we're never going to be able to rise to our full potential until everyone is afforded the same opportunity, the same protection under law, the same opportunity to advance for themselves, their families, their community, and this country. At the end of the day, that's what I want to be known for if I have the chance to serve as your president, giving everyone a chance to fulfill their potential, regardless of your religion, or who it is you love, or how many generations you can count your family in American, or whether you just got here yesterday. The color of your skin, your ethnicity, your country of national origin, no me importa, does not matter to me. All that matters is that you're an American, you're a human being, and we see ourselves as humans and Americans first before we see anything else, or take anything else into consideration. Otherwise, our differences will further divide this country. And this idea of America, the land it never has been yet, and yet must be, will never be realized. And we will lose this not just for ourselves, but for the generations that come. That is the test of this moment. That's why I'm running to serve you, and that's why I came to listen and learn from you as well. Thanks for having me out very much. So if okay with you, Tony, I'll just take questions or comments as you raise a hand, and we'll recognize you. If you don't have to ask, you can also tell or share. Yes?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abiola Adeseye. I'm a senior biology pharmacy student here. And I wanted to know, what are some mindsets, tools, and abilities that you would anticipate minority students will have to acquire when trying to attain higher education in the near future?
Yeah. Thanks for the question. past, my history, my opportunities, having the chance to go to college, taking out student loans, being the recipient of grants, working work-study jobs, but also my parents being able to support me by taking out loans themselves, loans that they were able to afford because they could put up their home as collateral. Recognizing that consciously this country has denied home mortgage loans for generations of people of color, specifically African Americans in the United States of America, making it harder for many to have the same experience or opportunities that I had. So how do we make sure that when we're talking about access to higher education, it's not a function of cost or privilege or luck or fortune or fate, but something that you can count on? My proposal is that at a minimum, the first 2 years of any higher education be free for the student and their families. A full 4-year education be debt-free for middle income and lower income Americans. Debt-free not just for tuition, which is important, but also for room and board and books, the full costs of being able to educate yourself, improve yourself, so you can improve our country. And I can tell just from your major that you'll be giving back so much more than you ever could have taken or received. It accrues to our mutual benefit. For those who graduated and hold student loan debt, there's $1.5 trillion of that debt outstanding right now. The ability to have it refinanced at the lowest possible interest rates. But then if you dedicate yourself to some kind of public service, so let's say as you take the next steps and pursue graduate courses and are able to take care of veterans who put their lives on the line at the VA, if that were the course you took, we would forgive your student loan debt so you could focus on those veterans. Or if you graduate with an education degree and you want to be a public school educator at a time that we have a severe teacher shortage, wipe clean and clear that student loan debt so you can focus on the students before you in that classroom. So one of the ways to meet your question is to remove the barriers of cost and opportunity to make sure that everyone can rise to that full potential academically, knowing that whatever the investment is, it will pale in comparison to the return we receive when you've been able to achieve that education and contribute something back far greater than you would have without that education. So thanks for asking the question. Appreciate it. Yes, and then I'll come back to that point.
Good afternoon. Hello. I am Elijah Brown Roberts, a freshman sophomore political science student, your future Secretary of Education. How intentional you can educate position is. In today's society, they're telling us that our bachelor's degree is going to be equivalent to an associate's degree. People are graduating with college degrees put in debt, whether they're poor, black, of color. They're being put into debt. They're graduating with a degree, and they're not able to find jobs. How do we make the system more intentional where everybody can get that job after they approve this debt, after they went through their 4 years of education?
Thanks for asking the question, and very much related to the last question, because we know there's a correlation between educational achievement and earning potential over the course of your lifetime. And so the more education you're able to get, the more you're able to earn, and also to give back, right? And also to set the generation that follows you on a course to allow them to achieve even more. At least that's how we want this to work, and that's how it is traditionally worked. So in addition to making sure that higher education is accessible to everyone in America, we also need to look at our K through 12 system and make sure that it's truly world class. One of the milestones in the exhibit that I was just looking at in the Civil Rights Museum was Topeka, Kansas, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And in addition to seeing the various governors standing in the doorways of schools to prevent integration, it also forced us to think about the fact that we still have some significant segregation in public education today. Some have said in some ways it is worse than it was on the eve of Brown versus Board in 1954. We can measure it, and we actually know that minority majority school districts are underfunded to the tune of about $23 billion a year, that much money. So meeting that gap in our administration every single year, so it should at least have equality in funding. And then taking the next step towards equity, which means that in Texas, and I don't know how it is in North Carolina, but a black child in the kindergarten classroom is 5 times as likely to be suspended or expelled or disciplined than a white child. And that's going to constrain that child's advancement over the course his or her education. So ensuring that we recruit teachers who look like the students before them is incredibly important. Funding HBCU's teacher training academies to the tune of $500 million a year to make sure that pipeline is there. Forgiving any outstanding student loan debt, we're not allowing that debt to be accrued in the first place, especially if you choose a career of public service. That's really important. And then extending learning in this country, not to just those who can afford it, but pre-K at 3 or 4 years old, universal for every child in America. We know that on the first day of kindergarten, some kids are already 10 months back in reading comprehension. And it's really hard to ever press pause and catch up to the rest of your cohort in your class. If we move the starting line back and also acknowledge this is connected to other issues. If your mother or father or both of them are working 2 or 3 jobs, they do not have the luxury to read to you before the first night of kindergarten. You will not be as prepared. So a living wage, healthcare, paid family leave, all of this is connected to your question about education, educational attainment, and then your earning power after you have graduated. So these are all investments and changes we need to make, but if we do so, I think our economy is really going to be able to work for everyone. Thanks for asking the question.
Hi, my name is Beto. I am a senior industrial engineering student here at A&T. My question for you is going back up what she said, what you were discussing about trying to provide funding for historically black colleges and trying to eliminate student debt and trying to nearly eliminate tuition for people trying to enter four-year public private universities. How do you go about doing that? How do you go about getting the funds, the money necessary to eliminate all of those expenses if you have the opportunity to become president?
Thanks for asking the question. So in addition to this $500 million a year invested in teacher training academies at HBCUs and minority serving institutions, we would also double HBCU funding from the federal government. That would be $10 billion over the next 10 years. What I've learned is that despite the extraordinary value that HBCUs provide, their endowments are underfunded and are very often not competitive with larger universities, public universities, or well-endowed private institutions. So if they're going to be able to compete and defray the cost of tuition, I've also seen the consequence there where students are having to pay more because there's less of an endowment to work with to defray their costs. If you're going to make sure that this is truly affordable, then we as Americans need to invest in the success of HBCUs. So those are the specific amounts that I would invest, but I also think it's really important to elevate the stories of schools like A&T, not just historically on February 1st, 1960, but what I learned from this classroom today, making sure that that travels with me across the country, and helping other Americans who may not have attended an HBCU or whose kids do not go to one to see the value for them as an American taxpayer. So thanks for asking the question. Appreciate it.
My name is Taylor Roberts. I'm a junior political science student. And my question for you is, as the Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization this year, I was wondering what role would HBCUs play? Basically, what seat would they have at that table? Because as we've already talked about, we have economic setbacks, but we also have legislative setbacks, which our campus is gerrymandered and split up within voting. So I wonder what role would HBCUs play in the reauthorization of that year, of this year, and what would be discussed about schools like this?
Thank you, Taylor, for the question, and I'll definitely, in addition to giving you my answer, confer with my Secretary of Education to make sure a complete perspective on this. It's interesting that you mentioned gerrymandering, and I didn't know that was something that you're experiencing here at A&T. In Texas, at Fairview A&M, we have another HBCU whose campus was divided into 2 precincts, who during early voting, I mentioned 50th in voter turnout, not by accident, but by design, who during early voting, at least for 1 week of early voting, did not have a polling location on campus, and how one incredibly courageous and motivated student led her fellow students on a 6-mile march to the voting location so that their hundreds of votes would be counted and be reflected and help determine the outcome of those elections at the county level, at the congressional level, and at the statewide level. And I'll tell you this, despite being 50th on the eve of that election in 2018, we turned out Texas in record numbers, led by young people at many of the HBCUs, Prairie View, A&M, but Paul Quinn College, TSU as well. Young voter turnout during early voting was up 500% from the previous midterm election. 2 new Democratic members of the House, flipping seats long held by Republicans, flipping the House of Representatives altogether. 17 African American women elected to judicial positions in Harris County, home of TSU. That changes the face not just of leadership, but of criminal justice in the most diverse city in the United States of America, Houston, Texas. So we've seen both the challenge, institutionalized on purpose and not an accident. It's very clear who is intended to vote, who is not intended to vote. And get this, one more thing I want to add. In Texas, tell me if it's the same way in North Carolina. Through our voter ID laws, you can use your license to carry a firearm to prove who you are at the ballot box, but you cannot use your student ID at Prairie View or A&M to prove who you are at the ballot box. Another indication of who is not supposed to vote in our state. So ending gerrymandering, racial, ethnic, partisan, or otherwise, not allowing politicians like me in the room when those congressional district lines are set is fundamental to getting our democracy back. When you add to that getting big money out of politics, having term limits, at least for members of Congress, so that you renew and refresh our democracy and our institutions, I think you then have a Congress, a democracy, a government that is truly representative of the diversity and genius of this country. So thanks for asking that question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kevin Seth Washington. I'm a junior pursuing a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science. I'm actually a native from Texas, so it is an honor to be in your presence. I lived in Fort Worth under the 12th Congressional District under Kate Granger, and then I went to school in the 10th in Austin. So I've always been close enough to see you, but I've never got to see you. So I'm glad to be here. But my question is, for your your debt-free plan, I was wondering where that money would come from. Like, would you have to cut other government expenditures, or would that come from taxpayers?
Thanks for asking the question. The answer is both, and I think the power of the answer is in the details. So, under the Trump tax cut, which was a $2 trillion windfall to the very wealthiest Americans and to corporations who were already sitting on record piles of cash, the corporate tax rate was taken from 35% down to 21%. If we were to roll that back, and not even all the way, just back up to 28%, you would generate hundreds of billions of dollars over the next 10 years. That alone would pay for the plan that we described. But if you went a step further and you were to tax capital gains at the same rate that we tax ordinary wage income, you would generate an additional hundreds of billions of dollars. But you also asked about cuts. So if we were to end the wars that we're fighting right now in Afghanistan in our 18th year, in Iraq our 28th year, in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Libya, you would realize hundreds of billions of dollars as a dividend for that peace. Those service members could come back home to their families and to this country. We could focus resources on those veterans who bore the battle in the first place, and then we could resolve that we're going to settle our differences with other countries around the world, not through the military, but through the State Department and working with other countries abroad. And then one more idea. If we were to legalize immigrants, who in many instances have been living here almost their entire lives, I'm thinking about dreamers, more than 1 million strong, some brought here at an age of 6 months or 3 years, who are as American as anyone else. If we legalize their parents and their brothers and sisters, it would generate $200 billion as a conservative estimate over the next 10 years. Again, resources that we could use to invest in people, in education, in healthcare, and in our communities. So the resources in the wealthiest country that humankind has ever known are here. It's just a matter of where we choose to direct them. Thanks for the question. Appreciate it. Cynthia, how much time do we have?
We have about 15 more minutes.
15? Okay, great.
Hello everyone, Joshua Burnell, junior mechanical engineering student. So I like the plan about the free college and making it more affordable, but one of the biggest issues we have is we're always talking about high school dropout rates, but we never talk about public higher education institutions these high dropout rates because they introduced policies like large class sizes, weed out classes. So how do you plan to make dropout rates decrease and increase graduation rates, as well as making college debt free? Because it's not only about making college free, it's about making people graduate as well.
Yeah, great question. I remember being in the panhandle of Texas, and was it in Donley, Texas? We had been eating Whataburger nonstop for months. Just a diet of fried foods, fried pies, Coca-Cola, and we saw this roadside produce stand, and we decided to pull over and try to get healthy. And there was this young man who was working the produce stand, and I asked him his story and to tell me a little bit about himself. And he mentioned that he had started out pursuing a degree at a university just outside of Amarillo, Texas, and then switched to the local community college, but was working 2 jobs, the produce stand. He also worked, and worked from Texas, he also worked as a cowboy, rustling cattle in the Caladero Canyon and returning them to their owners. But what he confessed to me is he said, despite the work-study jobs and despite the loans that I've taken on, some of which I'm already paying back, paying the interest, as well as trying to pay back the principal, I don't know that I'm gonna finish school. And if he were not to finish, he would be in the worst of all positions. Would not have had the educational attainment we just talked about that will be connected to his earning potential over the course of his life, but will have to pay back those student loans, perhaps making a minimum wage at that produce stand along the side of the road. So the 2 aspects of your question, I believe, are connected. If college is debt-free, those first 2 years, and he was actually just trying to earn, at that point, an associate's degree so he could get his welding certification. If that associate's degree is free to you, you no longer have the pressure to work multiple jobs or the fear of taking on that student loan debt that can be absolutely crushing, and you're now able to focus on your studies. That may not be the complete answer to your question. There may need to be greater involvement at the classroom level through counselors and staff to help young people navigate a college experience, to help keep them in those classrooms and to make sure that they graduate at the end of the day. So that's my best idea on it, but if you have more that you want to add to it, I'm all ears on that. I want to make sure, I've never been asked this question before, I want to make sure that we address that concern and make sure that if we're going to make that investment in people, and if people are going to make that own investment in themselves, that they're able to realize the true and full benefit of that. So, thank you.
Hello, I am currently a junior political science student here at A&T, also a fellow Texan, Fort County, born and raised.
Wonderful.
You mentioned earlier about the maternal mortality rate of Black people in America, and it's been shown time and time again that racial bias in our healthcare system is really life-threatening to us. I wanted to know if you see any initiative or any action in the education process of educating our doctors and all our healthcare officials on how to eliminate that bias, not just towards African Americans, but also towards people of lower socioeconomic levels in healthcare.
Thanks for asking the question. I do see that bias or the results of that bias. I have not experienced that bias, obviously, but we know both in the outcomes, it's not just the maternal mortality crisis, you're probably well aware of an infant mortality crisis, a disparity in infant mortality between white America and Black America that is greater today than it was in 1850, 15 years before the abolition of slavery. What accounts for that? It is not just the fact that we don't have universal health care, which is itself a vestige of racism and slavery in this country. It's a reason that we do not have universal health care. I learned more about it reading the 1619 Project on the New York Times website that helps to explain our healthcare system, our capitalism, our democracy in terms of our true founding, not July 4th, 1776, but August 20th, 1619, when the first slaves were kidnapped and brought here to this country. And it is now, as you point out, manifest in every part of our lives, including how you're treated even if you do have health care. The bias that some white medical providers have, that African Americans have a higher threshold or tolerance for pain than white people do. That their skin is tougher, that they're somehow built differently than white people are. And then also that the quality and continuity of care is far different. What's the answer to this? In addition to universal, guaranteed, high-quality care for everyone, we know that home health care visits for African-American women have improved outcomes for them and for their children, incorporating doulas and midwives into the full spectrum of maternal care that is covered under insurance in the United States, critically important. But you will never be able to get to the root of the problem unless you get to the root of the problem, and that is systemic, endemic, foundational racism in America. And until we all acknowledge that, and especially people who look like me acknowledge that, people who are running for positions of power like the one I am acknowledge that, I don't think we're ever going to change this in this country and change it for everyone in this country. So those are some of the practical steps that we can take, some of the evidence-based measures that we can adopt that will improve outcomes. But I think it's just so rooted in who we are as a country that if we don't confront that and change that, I don't know that we'll make it as good as it should be for everyone. So thanks for asking those questions. Yes, and I'll try to grab some around the back. And I'm too long in my answers. I'll try to shorten them so we can get more people in.
Hi, Lucy Pearsall-Finch. I'm a freshman mechanical engineering student. Sort of to piggyback off of your question, your answer. In terms of bridging that gap, in terms of what we understand to be systemic racism and our recognition of actually segregating the country, what are some of your ideas for that? So like I've been starting to network and do a little bit of research in terms of creating a parallel between what the Jews do with the Holocaust Museum and like doing that with African Americans. Smithsonian is now in DC. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Really like the parallel that you just drew. I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Brian Stevenson, Just Mercy, and the way that he's tried to ensure that we not only don't forget our history, but for many of us who never do it in the first place, really learn the true, full story of the United States of America. And I had a chance to talk to him once briefly, and he set me on a different course. When I talked about civil rights, I would talk about, I used to call them Greensboro for, I talk about the A&T for, I talk about Martin Luther King Jr., I would talk about Rosa Parks, I would talk about these heroes and their achievements, because I think it made me feel okay, and that things were getting better, and that we had satisfied the need or the demand. And what he reminds us, and what I saw in the Civil Rights Museum, is it's also Emmett Till, and it's also the lynchings, and it's also the cross burnings, and it's also what is happening right now in this country. Mother Emanuel AME in Charleston, or I mentioned the Walmart shooting in El Paso, Texas, that this is alive and well. And Christopher Wray, who is the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigations, placed there by President Trump, in testimony to Congress, I believe last month or the month before, said that the majority of domestic terror cases that he's investigating right now, that they are pursuing, involve white nationalists or white supremacists in this country. So it is a very real, present threat to us. But Mr. Stevenson's approach is making sure that perhaps in the way that in Germany after World War II, we, the occupiers and the Soviets and the Allied victors, made everyday Germans go to the gas chambers and the concentration camps and make sure that they could never deny their history. You had to see it with your own eyes. You could not avert your gaze, you could not turn your back, you could not disown this, you could not have a revisionist history to say that the everyday average German was not in some way complicit with what was happening. After the end of apartheid in South Africa, you had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. After the genocide in Rwanda, Hutus and Tutsis coming together to understand their shared history and past, all of which instrumental to being able to move forward. We've never done that. I've never had that conversation. There are things I never learned in my history textbook in high school or in college about the foundation of this country, and who it is that we still honor in America today, and who it is that we have forgotten in America today. So what's the mechanism to do this? Honest answer is I don't all the way know, and I don't know that any of us all the way knows. A great place to start, in my opinion, is a reparations commission that has been proposed by Sheila Jackson Lee, who is a congresswoman from Houston, Texas. What this does is it provides the means to have this conversation on a national basis, and share that story with everyone, and bring everyone's story in. But to Mr. Stevenson's point, it would really only be successful if it were to be continued or initiated in the first place on a community basis, much the way that it's happening here in Greensboro. So those are a couple of thoughts on a really important question. Very much appreciate you asking. Thank you. Go back to this corner, and then we'll come back to you.
How are you? My name is Beto. I'm a sophomore social worker and female student here at Wayne State University.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so my question is actually like about what you were just speaking on Ryan Stevenson. I actually heard him speak, and one thing he brings up is our prisons here. So I know the population of people who look like us is crazy, it's outrageous. And how do we, I guess, combat things like, companies like Victoria's Secret and Pink are still using these privatized prisons for free labor for people that look like us who's paying them like 10 cents a day, $1 a day. And it's like, how do we get rid of this new slavery, because it is slavery?
I, not too long ago, saw a documentary called 13th, and didn't understand that in the immediate aftermath of the abolition of slavery, there was left a legal mechanism through the 13th Amendment criminalizing people based on the color of their skin to put them into a new form of slavery. And in some ways, even more perverse, because it was legally defined in the Constitution. And the supply of labor was almost limitless. And one of the docents who just guided us on this tour said, here you have people who were enslaved, who after enslavement were penniless, were landless, were not afforded the opportunity to work, and could legally be arrested for being homeless, for loitering, for just being alive and being black. And they were. Somebody introduced themselves as being from Fort Bend County. And that is the home of the Imperial Sugar Plantation, which after slavery worked with local law enforcement to press African American men and boys into service who were worked to death. We know that because they're building a new school in Fort Bend County, and as they're preparing the ground, they're discovering the bones that show that the muscles have been torn from the bones, so literally worked into the grave for no other crime than the color of their skin. I only say that because I just want to establish that it is nothing new and is absolutely foundational to who we are. That 2.3 million people behind bars population that I described earlier, disproportionately comprised of color. White people, black people use marijuana at the same rate. Black people are more likely than white people to be stopped, to be frisked, to be arrested, to serve time, and to suffer the consequences after they are released. Some have described this war on drugs, or war on communities, as the new Jim Crow. And I think that's a pretty apt description for the consequences and the outcomes of what we see. So how do we change this? You mentioned for-profit prisons. We ban for-profit prisons in the United States. No one should be able to get rich on depriving another person of their liberty and their freedom. No one should have the resources to lobby members of Congress to set mandatory minimums, or 3 strikes and you're out, or keeping marijuana as a Schedule I drug. You cannot die no matter how much of it you smoke. It's not good for your head, especially if your brain is still developing, which the brains of everyone in this room still are. But it is nowhere near as dangerous as the opioids that are legally sold to our fellow Americans, that consume the lives of nearly 70,000 people just last year, without a single official at Purdue Pharma or Johnson & Johnson serving a single night in a single county jail. So ending for-profit prisons, ending the war on drugs, ending the prohibition of marijuana, expunging the arrest records for anyone caught in possession of a substance that is legal in more than half the states in this country, and then getting away from an incarceration, imprisonment first mentality, which has to be connected with keeping people of color down by law in this country. Again, we have to be explicit and intentional about what we're saying, what we're trying to get to, and how we got here in the first place. Those are some of the ideas that I bring to the table. And then one last one, we mentioned the kindergarten classroom and disparity in discipline and treatment. There begins the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline in this country. If we're able to attract and retain more teachers of color in those classrooms, we're going to begin to end that pipeline in this country. So thanks for asking this question. gonna let you pick the three, and I promised you that I'd answer your question, and I'll allow you, Tony, to pick the last two. So I'm not the bad guy.
My name is Brittany, I'm a sophomore political science student. I'm originally from California, and this year, they've now implemented free community college processing, which I wish they hadn't done. But how do you feel about implementing that large-scale cross-promotion, just to kind of make, for a student like me, who the route which is easier to go that way, making our paper?
I think it makes all the sense in the world. As president, I would seek to implement that. As a member of Congress, I remember President Obama at one of his State of the Union addresses to Congress and to the country made that a goal and made the case that whatever the additional investment on the part of the U.S. taxpayer, we are more than paid back in the lifetime earning potential of the beneficiary, or the great things that they're going to invent, or the cases that they're going to be able to prosecute or defend, or the art that they'll produce that will change our lives. Whatever it is that they were placed on the planet to do, they'll now be educated enough to be able to do that. So I think this makes all the sense in the world, and the only thing that I would add to it is just making sure that in addition to 2 years for an associate's degree, perfectly free in this country, we ensure that getting a bachelor's or a 4-year degree is debt-free for lower income, middle income, and we have debt repayment programs, including wiping debt clean for public service for those who've already gone to college and have already taken on a loan. So I really want to make sure that we deliver for everyone. Thank you.
We'll get that guy now. All right.
My name is Kyla. I'm a junior political science student. And my question is, how do you think you could shift the higher political education, like focus from STEM to social things, to political education, to things that aren't STEM? Because I feel like the climate in the country would suggest that we would need more of that. And also, like, if it were Amazon in this room, it would be, regardless of like Amazon, like exploiting workers, that doesn't matter. But like, how do you think you could do that on a federal level so that students like us don't get ignored? Because here at A&T, we have the largest college, and I would say confidently that we probably get the least amount of funding. We have chalkboards, and engineering is giving like a new glass building, which is amazing, but also we get chalkboards.
Right.
So how do you think you could reverse that for us?
This is the first time I've ever received this question, and I traveled all 254 counties in Texas for 2 years. Been traveling much of the United States over the last 6 months. It is so thoughtful and so important, and as an English major, I'm really glad that you asked it. I was in remedial algebra for 3 of my last 3 years of high school. I just never, I could never get there. The STEM disciplines, so important, were not really where I thrived. And thankfully, I had extraordinary teachers in high school and then on in college who were able to connect with me in a way that I hope helped to bring out the very best in me. Gave me the opportunity to start a small business in El Paso, run and serve in public office, and now be here before you. And I've got to think that a lot of the challenges that we face as a country will require those kinds of disciplines and that kind of learning. And to your point, this kind of investment in fields outside of the sciences and technology and engineering and math, as important as they are, and I don't think one has to come at the consequence of the other. As you pointed out, they're not mutually exclusive. You want that new building constructed, you just want to make sure that there are resources here for the liberal arts as well. And I've got to also think that that is something that has helped to distinguish the United States of America globally. The ideas that we create, the songs and poetry that we write and produce, the diplomacy that we led, especially after World War II, that helped to put us in this position of greatness that we're now in. I think all of that should not just be celebrated, but invested in up front. And since it's the first time I've been asked this question, let me go back and, Cynthia, if you don't mind making a note, and think about what that would look like in terms of policy, higher education policy specifically, and what policy exists right now, if any exists, because I know, to your point, so much of the focus has been on STEM right now. Having said that, do you have an idea about how we could meet this need or this challenge?
Maybe like not stepping on students from an administrative level when students in these places like get together and share ideas and things like that, because I also feel like the kind of shrinking of resources for us is intentional. When it comes to students who like move and shake on campus, students who want to push new ideas and stuff like that, because STEM folks, they're amazing, they're awesome. But like when you see people at this university who are on the forefront of pushing change for like the well-being of the student body, they're usually not STEM people, which is the truth. And I think people in here can vouch with me for that. So maybe like from that way, not stepping on students, but also shining a light on the importance of it in the first place. And taking it out of a capitalist vision of, okay, these people make money, so this is where we're gonna put our resources.
Yeah.
And turning it into a thing of like, okay, we have to live. Because I feel like if it weren't for people who do the political science thing, who do the education thing, y'all would be dead. Like, everyone would die because capitalism would literally kill you. So maybe that, I don't know what that would look like from whatever federal thing y'all
Right.
do, but those are just like ideas on the conversation.
Thank you. Very, very much. This will be our last question, so no pressure.
Hi, my name is Kiana Kizzy. I'm a senior political science student. We talked a lot about college accessibility and making sure that people can get through college, but the SAT and ACT scores tend to have a very racial bias because they're dependent on access to technology, resources, and just teaching in general. How do you plan to transform the college application process to make it more accessible to students who don't necessarily have those resources?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for a really, really good question. I think it begins with an acknowledgement of the truth that you just shared. That is not necessarily widely accepted. It's certainly not adopted in terms of the practices that would account for the bias in those standardized tests. Some of which is in the forms of the questions that are asked and the expectations of the experiences that the students have had when they're answering those questions, as well as the access to technology and education and training and the kind of help that you need outside of the classroom to make sure that you're performing at your best when you sit down and take that test. So whatever ways we can add to, and we talked some of it in terms of funding the $23 billion gap that we have right now at minority serving public school districts, filling that immediately in our administration, to the equity gap that we have right now in terms of the public educators that we are attracting and funding and retaining in our public schools, to the investment in technology, and to the quality of the buildings in which we're educating our students. We were just in South Carolina learning about the corridor of shame and the underinvestment and the deferred maintenance that has taken place that has undermined and diminished the learning potential of the students in those facilities. This is not an inexpensive proposition, but like college or community college or universal preschool, the investment made not only guarantees greater dignity in the lives of those who are finally recognized for their worth and their value, but also in what they're going to be able to produce afterwards. And to the young one's point, not just in how we measure it in terms of how much you earn, but the quality of life that you improve, what you're able to produce for the rest of us, that makes life better for all Americans. So that's the way I guess I begin to address that. But again, as with the last question asked, would love to get you a specific answer on where federal policy can meet this challenge. So if we can follow up by email or phone with those last two questions, that would be great. Yeah. Tony, thank you for having us out. Thank you all for allowing me to join us.